Okay, it's 7:30, so we'll make a start. Welcome to this British Academy lecture. It's part of a series of lectures that are organised by the British Academy. This particular one is hosted in partnership with the University of East Anglia. So for those that don't know, the British Academy is the National Academy for the SHAPE disciplines, that's the social sciences, humanities and arts for public and the economy. So these lectures, which are occurring all around the country, provide a showcase for the sort of very best SHAPE research. My name's Andy Jordan. I work here at the University of East Anglia. I'm a fellow of the British Academy, and as well as that, I direct the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. So today's lecture is going to be given by Nick Pidgeon, who's also a fellow of the British Academy. So just a few words about Nick. So Nick is a Professor of Environmental Psychology and Risk at the University of Cardiff. His work spans, I think, rather uniquely the worlds of research and also of policy. So his research has covered issues to do with risk understanding, risk perception, human behaviour, public engagement, often in relation more recently to low carbon technologies, but going back throughout his career, and he may cover this in his lecture, he's covered other technologies such as nuclear power or genetically modified food. On the policy side, he's done all sorts of different things with research councils, with charities, with parliaments, with government departments. At the moment, he sits on the Science, Technology and Advisory Committee of DESNZ, which is the Department for Energy Supply and Net Zero. He has also done a similar role in the Department of Transport as well. So a huge amount of policy experience as well. His various contributions to academia and also to policy have been recognised in a whole variety of different ways. So, for example, he was awarded an MBE in 2014 for services to climate change awareness and energy security, and then in 2023 he was elected to the British Academy. So, yes, a warm welcome to Nick, or should that be a warm welcome back to Nick? Because Nick was actually here for a number of years between, I had to look, 1999 and 2006. So please join me in welcoming Nick back to UEA.
Yes, thank you, Andy, so much. And it is an absolute pleasure to be back at UEA, for which I have some very, very fond memories here. I would say also I will talk a little bit about some of the work that we did when I was here. So what's this all about? The overview, I've got a few things to talk about. Environmental crisis and complexity and why we see it as a complex problem. Because we're here representing the academy, I want to talk a little about why arts and social sciences matters. And I know environmental science here has got social scientists in it. There was a good reason why I went there in the first place. And for various reasons, it adds to the natural science work that's going on hugely. And the Academy is the champion of that in the UK. I'm going to talk a bit about policy, then something we've been toying with out of some of our own work, which is something we call lively methods, which you might find interesting. And then if I get to it, I've got two examples. The first one certainly I will talk about, and possibly the second one as well, and then make a few concluding comments when I get to the end. And you might hear my voice as I've had a cold, or might have been COVID actually, about a month ago, and so I'm trying to speak as, efficiently as possible. This was on the flyer, and I thought, going to an environment lecture, I must send a picture of, a porpoise or maybe a beautiful tree, something like that. But in the end, I picked this one, which I took myself. We've done a lot of work in South Wales, in the communities which are deindustrialising. And this is a place called Aberavon. It's in Port Talbot, South Wales. In fact, you can see down bottom right-hand side, it was a winter afternoon evening I went, and you can see the steelworks there, obviously, and then you look, and it has this amazing sunset. So people love it for the sunset. So it's not just a place of industry, it's a place of natural beauty as well. And it's a bit like, and then somebody pointed out the photo is a bit like a Lowry scene, that you've got this huge modernity represented by the steelworks. It was, until it's changed and closed its blast furnaces, the biggest single emitter of carbon dioxide in Wales. And yet, society is also connected to that. So you can see in the picture I've got there, a few people, using the facilities, not bothered. They want to walk their dogs on the beach and have a good evening out. And the environment is there as well. So you've got the beach and you've got the sea, and you've got the threat from the sea as well with the sea defences, which will be challenged. So I thought it's kind of an interesting, just think about, and the problems we are faced as environmental and social scientists around the environment have those three elements, don't they? They have the environment, they have people and communities, and they have the issues of modernity that are really driving things like climate change and biodiversity loss. So I think that's a nice place to start this talk. And of course, my side is thinking about the people side and how they interact with some of these. There we go. So first, complexity. Lots of people have written about this, and I'll just put it on the table. The problem with the environmental crisis, it is the systems are complex. You've studied it here at UEA over many, many years. They're complex biological systems, they're complex physical systems, the air, the water, the interaction between those. Some of it's highly uncertain, there are multiple feedbacks. But as soon as you bring the people side in, then suddenly there are things that are disputed, so not everybody agrees. Interestingly, something that I'd not realised, but been thinking about recently, often there's not what you could call a stopping rule, where you know you've got enough scientific evidence to do X. And we know there's now a backlash against climate policy for sure coming. Some of you will see from some of the election manifestos that have been around. The stopping rule is going to be a point of contention amongst the political parties for sure. But even scientists don't know when they've got enough information to really say we should do that to solve this part of the problem. And then the solutions are fragmented and at best only better or worse. So I could have shown you so many systems diagrams, but the complexity, this is actually from the National Security Assessment, which looks at various threats to the UK, and some of the complexity is there. There are background drivers, there are indirect drivers which are at several levels, global, national, local, and then different direct drivers of loss and change in terms of biodiversity and climate impacts. And put that together, and it's actually quite a complicated system to do anything with. On the values, we could say a lot about this diagram, but I'll just point out, some people would say the market will solve the environmental crisis for us if we shape it the right way. Others, certainly the current Green Party's view would be you have to take a very different view on the role of the markets and consumption there. That's North Norfolk, the coast, and stopping rule. When do we know enough to evacuate people or to invest in protection of a particular part of the coast? It's not always clear. Some of the time it is. So, and that's a simple example here where the local authorities are obviously grappling with that problem day in, day out and worrying about parts of the coast that may bring parts of the environment or people into risk. And then solutions. Again, do we try and work on these big background drivers? Do we work at several levels on the indirect or direct drivers? Or do we just do what we can do? And I like this one. This shows kind of that the solutions are often fragmented and it's hard to join them up. But this is a nice initiative. Lots of local authorities are changing the way they mow their grass verges. And if you do it in the right order and don't put too much extra fertilizer or herbicide on, you will get wildflower verges at certain times of the year. And that's a really good way of generating a wildlife corridor. But how do you then connect that to the sea level rise that's affecting the coast in North Norfolk? So you can do bits of the problem, but trying to solve the whole problem is much more difficult. So now, I don't want to send everybody away feeling really kind of depressed, but you could be when you think about the environment some of the time. So this is just a good news story that's been going on for quite a while. This was on Friday. the electricity generator has a special website which will give you all these stats live in time, and then there are various people who translate it for you onto a much more friendly website. So this one was somebody called Kate Morley. It's live information, and you will see there at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, almost 40% of the electricity in this country was being generated by renewable power, which is amazing when you consider you go back 15 years and there was almost none in the mix other than a little bit of water power primarily up in Scotland. There's some nuclear going at the same time, and then we've got various interconnectors in and out. So some was coming in from Belgium and Denmark, and then we were exporting also to Ireland. So it's quite a complex system that's going on here, being balanced. I'll just make one point, and then minus 2.2 to storage. So that was in North Wales. They've got some storage systems where they pump water up, and then when they need it in the peak, it comes back down again. That is one of the biggest technical challenges I think the engineers are working on, is long-term storage. So it's not immediate storage. It's how can we use some of the stuff we've got in the summer from solar and from wind when it's going well, into long-term storage. And I won't say any more about that. I just put that on the table as an interesting challenge for any engineers here. So what's the role of the social sciences? Now, this I call the What Good is History challenge. Okay, so I sat, and one or two of us have sat in dinners or meetings with not very friendly business people, mostly men, or not very friendly ministers who kind of grilling us and saying, well, what good is social science to sorting out the environment or anything, or anything? And I would point out, psychology is, in my own main discipline, has, through talking therapy, let's say, has made huge strides in helping people with mental health problems in ways that would have been treated with drugs in the past, but are not. And it's much better. So they get through all these examples, and we can prove that economists have done some good stuff, but then they eventually think they've got you, so they say, what good is history? Seriously, what good is history? But actually, here at M, some of you will know, but maybe not all of you, that when the university was set up in 1965, they set up this interdisciplinary environmental science school, very innovative at that time, and they wanted to work on climate change. But they did not know what the climate record was. And at that time, they were not doing things like going to Antarctica and getting ice cores and looking at what was in there to work out what the back climate was, which you can do now. So they employed Hubert Lamb, who was a climatologist, but he had an interest in history, and he had worked out that in museums, in other documents that were there, you had evidence which, if you could work out which was the reliable evidence, would tell you what the climate record was. And he did that. And so, in fact, he published this paper. You can't see it very well, from 1965, which is amazing, which is the records of vineyards in the south of England in the medieval period, showing when the vineyards were actually working, which meant, at what point was the temperature there. So the department here got ahead in climate change because it did a lot of history work to try and work out the back climate. And then the scientists here, some of you who will be here as well, were able to then use that to project forward. And there's something in the social sciences, you live your life forward, but you understand life backwards. And I think that's a really good example of that case. So history is good. Other disciplines that SHAPE would represent, think about what needs to change on the mitigation side of climate change. The industrial base, how we heat our homes. Rurality is definitely going to have to change. How we travel, how we generate and distribute power, and our relationship with stuff and excess consumption. And then you can say, well, if you're thinking from a social science perspective, what's relevant? And in fact, of course, if you come to Port Talbot, and again, history as well, you need sociology and anthropology to understand the community there and the impact of the changes that are happening there with the production of steel and the long history of coal and steel production in that area, to understand how the community is responding to the changes that are likely to happen. Homes and lives, they're obviously architects, design the things. And sociologists and psychologists understand how people live in homes. And it's surprising how many supposedly low-carbon homes are designed in ways that didn't take any account of the people or the animals that might be living there. And therefore, sometimes they don't operate as well as they should because the people have not been accommodated. Rural spaces, I think that's fairly straightforward. Geography, law as well is very important. How we travel, that's planners, economists as well. How we generate district power, all of the above, plus. And I've added linguistics because a lot of this is about discourse and how, so that's, as you know, Welsh, dim is no, and it's no pylons, and that's in Mid Wales where we've got a controversy. I know you've got one here in East Anglia as well, around the siting of pylons for the grid upgrade that some people want to do. That's actually for a private line, so there's reasons why there's particularly intense opposition to that. But it's a political question, it's got some psychology involved, and other shape disciplines. And then interestingly, if you think about consumption, all those arts, design, and fashion side of the social sciences and arts have a lot to say about that as well. So I think there's a big agenda just to say why the British Academy is important in this space. Andy's been involved in this. There are 2 programs. You can go and have a look, looking at sustainability, recent ones, both on place-sensitive, how we live, and then a net zero governance program, which has just finished. So there are some good documents and information on how some of the scientists within, social scientists and artists within the Academy have been dealing with some of these issues. On adaptation, if we go on to the Norfolk case of sea level change in this area, and we've got it in Wales as well, and it's a bit difficult to see, but that is Fairbourne, which is in Barmouth, next to Barmouth in North Wales. And they're basically below sea level. So they are at risk of serious loss of life were the seawall to be breached. And the local council has decided, they have decided a stopping rule. They've said, I think it's 2040, they will no longer maintain the seawall. So that's left the poor residents in a really difficult position because, A, their houses have suddenly become worth nothing. They've got to decide where to go if they want to go. They've got all the anxiety about risk, etc. And again, that's not a technical or scientific question. That is a question of a community facing a catastrophe. And how do we actually support that? Where do these people go? How do we support them in that change that is obviously going to have to come if the council follows through with this to decide not to actually defend the seawall. And there will be lots of other places in the UK, given the projections of sea level rise, particularly on the east side of the country, where this will play out again. So I talked to the Met Office a few times. They're not so far away from me in Cardiff, down in Exeter, and they're always talking about their graphs and their projections, but I always remind them, look, there are people involved in all of this. You need to think about the behavioural and sociological side of these changes. Okay, and those are the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and you can see again, it is about environment, but it's also about people and communities, so why would the social science disciplines not have a lot to say about meeting some of these? Okay, so, and the other thing I'll say, at last, as a psychologist, there's been a realization within government that people and behaviour matter for, particularly for climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. They don't want to go as far as they should, and there's been, I hate to say it, a reluctance amongst government ministers to be seen to be telling anybody to do anything, particularly under the last administration. So it was very difficult then for the officials to raise this question. But there is now kind of a discussion going on about what a net zero society might look like. And so there are a number of documents there. The ESRC as well, I'm involved in this. This was an outcome of the pandemic that a lot of behavioural scientists were pulled into advisory roles when the pandemic occurred, because obviously there were a lot of behavioural issues involved with protecting from that virus. It wasn't just an epidemiological or medical thing. And ESRC then decided or realised that we needed a capability in behavioural research, and that was all brought together as a result of that. So there are links across these that are starting to be made, which is very, very welcome from my perspective. So Some of the challenges, Andy said I'd suggest show a few of these from my past, and they are, I'm not going to read them all out. I'll give you a couple of examples of these a bit later as I go along. But the first one was, when I was here at UEA, there was a huge furore going on about GM agriculture. So I got hauled onto a Royal Society committee, and they never said this, and it was never in the terms of reference, but I was told in no uncertain terms in the cafe as it was starting, we want nanotechnology, by the way, is the technology of very small components, so it's basically molecular physics and chemistry, with some quite interesting novel applications. We don't want nanotechnologies coming along. We want to avoid what happened with GM agriculture. So can we try and kind of find out what the public thinks about this? And then a whole bunch of work was done on that. And the answer was actually nanotechnology wasn't really like GM agriculture, so it didn't have the same triggers that had led to the first big controversy in the late 1990s. I'm going to talk about the Consensus on Climate Change report, which I think is quite important and interesting. And then severe winter flooding, so one's often pulled in at quite short notice when an emergency has occurred. I mean, COVID was like that, but there have been other instances where government gets together policy experts as they see it. I'm sure Andy and a few people from MPIR have been involved in that type of panel as well, to bring your expertise to bear. The most recent one was, this was for the Behavioural Research Hub, and we were asked about a year ago now, exactly a year ago, we know there's going to be a very hot summer coming, and somebody thinks the communications for wildfire, overheating and drought may be in conflict. And these have all been produced by completely different bits of government, of course, and fire services, and DEFRA if it's, and agricultural people if it's drought. And the thing they worried about was telling people, we've got a drought, so save water, and then the health authorities are saying, no, drink water and take frequent baths. And so if you've got those two messages, which of those messages people are going to actually attend to? Now, it turned out there weren't a lot of contradictions, so that was a good thing. But that's the kind of policy question that sometimes comes from government, which academics can help try to unravel, let's put it that way. What triggers it? Sometimes you get a policy pull. So there's an emergency response, and they will, or it's something about the environment, and they'll say, we'll ring up people, we know Andy or whoever it is at Environmental Sciences at UEA, they know about X. Let's get their view on what's going on. And those are some of the ways it happens. Equally, often there can be a research push. So policy hasn't really got to grips with an issue, but the researchers know there's a question. So a good example would be ozone depletion, which was dealt with in the 60s, 50s and 60s. Climate science was way ahead of the policymakers in terms of starting to sound the alarm on that. And species loss, obviously, and the small example I'll show is some public attitudes evidence, which did find its way into the public domain. Often, though, it's a much more co-constructed thing that's going on, by which I mean research is funded, researchers do their work, they talk to policymakers. The complexity of the system means that nobody's got a straightforward answer to any of it, and bit by bit, some of the key issues suddenly emerge, and then maybe you'll get a coalition around a question, and somebody will work, or a group will work on that in great detail. So it's not as simple as just policy pull and research push. I think that would be fair to say. Just to say, those are the questions I got before, and these are some of the vehicles. So the Royal Society Commission I was on, then in 2006 there was a parliamentary inquiry into climate change consensus. So that involved submissions, synthesis and a report. The energy question, you find lots of science advice out there, absolutely, over many years, and a lot going on. It continually happens. You continue to get asked questions. The most recent one that I mentioned is long-term energy storage, because I know Department of Energy Net Zero actually commissioned a very, very rapid piece of research on that, because they wanted to know what technologies they might be backing or should be backing in the future. Then you've got the emergency system, which stands up when something really serious happens. And then advisory panels, we're very keen on those in Wales. So you bring in a whole bunch of people from different political and other interest groups to try and work out an agreed report. And then a rapid evidence review. All of these, actually, you notice there's a synthesis going on. So this is the first thing. People sometimes say to me, younger academics, how do you create impact from our research? And I'll tell you now, you can't quite read that probably at the back. This is one of my greatest papers. I love it. We did a great piece of work on it. The title is The Infrastructural Ecologies of Industrial Decarbonisation, Visual Methods and Psychosocial Logics in Place-Based Public Engagement. Great. I love it. And I know there are some people in the audience who would love to go and read this paper. But you cannot send it to the minister. It's impossible. He or she probably now, or even an official, they will not read it. It's just not the route. So, and I can assure you about that. So, no. What you have to do is something a bit different. It's what I would call the Friday afternoon briefing. And either as an expert, you know it, so you've got a question that comes in, and you can spend an afternoon and you can write what you know in 2 pages and send it off. And if you can do that, and it's in simple language, and if you can't do it, you just say no. It's not for me, somebody else in the department or somebody else in another university. Or there are parliamentary submissions, lots of us do that, and you spend more time over that. So there'll be a call for evidence, and you would write maybe 4 or 5 pages, which would reference these wonderful papers, but wouldn't put it in quite the same language. You can obviously do committee memberships. I've done a lot of that. And again, for younger academics, choose the committees carefully, but it's very valuable to go on policy committees if they're bang in your area, whether it's health or environment or behaviour change or whatever. So that's another important route. And I think, increasingly that's being recognised by the universities as something that's very legitimate. Engage key stakeholder panels, that's important. If you've got a big project, so bring in a series of engaged stakeholders who can help you construct that research program. And then increasingly it's blogs and social media, which I'm not, and so actually this paper ended up in a blog that's just on the UCIRT website. So engaging publics, something we've been thinking about is how to do this. It's been received wisdom within the science and technology studies of certainly new technologies that you have to have public participation. If you don't have that, then all sorts of unintended consequences are likely to happen. It's actually quite easy to do relatively easy to do the participation. I'll show you some examples. It's the indecisions bit which is more tricky, that feeding it through into policy, and that doesn't always happen in the way either you would anticipate or it should. But anyway, and I mentioned that Helen's up here, the UCIRT Public Engagement Observatory is here as well, and they do this very valuable job of bringing together UK-based examples of where either engagement has been organised or citizens have done their own engagement around energy for low carbon. And if you're interested in some of those case studies, I would tell you go and have a look at that because it really is valuable. But the principle of public participation goes back maybe about 40 years, I would say, and it has particular philosophical roots, which I won't go into the reasons why you would do it. So that's a set of guidelines actually some of us wrote for climate engineering, which is a slightly controversial technology, about 20 years ago, and participation was absolutely one of the central things. So the thing we've worked a lot on, which is why, again, the arts thing comes in, is how do you take a group of citizens, if you want to do public engagement, how do you take a group of citizens who probably don't know much about steelmaking or whatever the top, or nuclear power, definitely not nanotechnology, and have a conversation, probably for a day or maybe 2 days, split over a week, something like that, to get their views, their kind of informed views. So you've got to put information in, you've got to have, give them time to think through the issues. So we've been thinking around a number of ways of engaging people. There's a document on the British Academy website under the net zero governance approach where we've talked about what we call lively methods for net zero governance and public engagement. What we mean by that is the change you're thinking about might be technical or it might be an local environmental change, but you're trying to put the people side into it, so people kind of insert themselves or insert their community or insert an imagined community in the future. Because it's only that way you can kind of try to understand that complex interaction between the change and the society that's sitting there. So I'll give you a good example. Here's a Port Talbot one we did about 7 years ago, and we were working on future scenarios for the town. At the time, the steelworks are still operating. So we ended up with 4 scenarios, plus lots of information, lots of discussion. We got people to talk. So, for example, Energy Island, down the bottom right-hand, was very much a contained system. So you didn't have a major national grid, but you were trying to generate all the energy that the town needed through both the steelworks still operating, but other activities that were going on there. And I'll just show you this, that one of the things that came out of that, apart from the fact that history was very important, so how people were interpreting the change was rooted in the historical understandings, was that the energy island was kind of quite popular for people because they liked the idea of energy independence, but they understood the dilemma that it might not have resilience, and therefore you probably needed a grid as a backup. So there wasn't an ideal answer to that. The other thing we've done is use experiment with what we call personas, where we give people 10 pictures of hypothetical persons. Having gone through all the stuff about how Port Talbot might change, we would say, think about this person, write a story about them in this future we're talking about. It's quite a well-known technique as well in the social sciences. And what you get then is it highlights, people bring what we call relational and emotional concerns to the surface. So whereas 5 minutes ago they were talking about how the steelworks was going to go electric, now they're talking about their granny who's hard of sight. She's got her assistance dog with her, and how she's going to struggle in this new future we're all talking about, which has got smart technology, etc. So it brings out the hidden facets of community and place and people. It's a really interesting method. And then this final one, Valuing Nature Programme, we were looking at salt marshes. We were trying to understand the non-economic value of salt marshes to people. I'm sure some of you have seen the ones on the Norfolk coast. Here we were in Wales. This is a place called Larne, which is where Dylan Thomas, the famous poet, had his final home. That's his house there, actually overlooking the marsh. And actually the town's quite unusual. They've refused to have concrete defences put in as a town, so they just have the salt marsh in front of their homes. And some of the homes have individual defensive, but they don't have a seawall. And what we did was walking interviews, which is a technique from geography. We got people who lived there to all tape recorded, bring some photos in. We had some photos of the place as well, and they would walk around the place and tell us. I won't read all of that out. You can come back to me and ask for the paper if you wish. But really rich data on the things that they valued about the place and why the salt marsh was really important for them, and definitely not an economic. The one that came out from Larne was it's got a long history of cockling, or did in the past, so people bring those resonances of the old, effectively, fishing industry into their understanding of the place. Okay, I might not get to my second case, but I'll do the first one and see where we get. How long have we got?
15 minutes.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, I'll rattle through this one. So this was the first one I was involved in, which really did have quite a lot of impact, and was unintended in the sense that we didn't see it coming. It was when I was here. And just to explain a bit of theory, there's something called the policy windows model, which says, it's very simple, that now and again, a set of circumstances will align which allow you, as either a policy entrepreneur or maybe an academic, or somebody who wants to get something done, to get it through the policy system, and then something happens. And the reason why I came across this many years ago, I started work looking at major accidents. So I was interested in how planes crash and the responses to big terrorism events, etc. And there'd been a number of examples where major disasters had very quickly led to change in health and safety legislation in the US and one or two other places, or gun law. In Australia was a really good example about, I think 30 years ago, there was a big event where lots of children were killed, and they suddenly changed the gun laws in Australia. And that's what's called a policy window, that something triggers them off. People, and Andy's talked a lot about this in his work as well, so this is a bit simplistic, but you tend to get 3 things have to align So you have a problem stream. How does the problem become significant for policy? There's a politics stream. Stuff is going on in the political sphere, which brings some of that together. And then a policy stream, which is interesting, say it's a soup of competing solutions. There's a sense in which it's helpful if the answer is already out there, because then the other two kind of processes pick up the answers, sift them, and try and work out which one to apply. That's why actually think tanks are a really good thing, because they are always thinking up interesting solutions to difficult problems, even though they know at this point in time they might not be able to put them into place. So here, this was interesting, and it's only really after the event you know there was a policy window there. This was around climate change, and should we basically have a climate change act, which we did eventually in 2008, and should we have statutory climate targets, which we do. Scientific evidence was building up, so that was the science was forcing it into the political arena. And in fact, actually, Gleneagles G8 was overshadowed, obviously, by the bombings in London. The 7/7 bombings were during Gleneagles. But Tony Blair had put climate change onto the agenda for Gleneagles. But again, it was sort of got swept aside in the tragic events that occurred. So that all happened. And then Friends of the Earth came along and did a big campaign called the Big Ask, which started in the May. And then they persuaded the politicians, the backbenchers, to put in an early day motion with them, which they did, which was signed by a very large number of backbench MPs across all the political spectrum, because they felt the Blair government wasn't getting on with legislating properly for climate change. And it was described to me afterwards. Well, I said, well, you know, what's going on here in Parliament when this kind of thing happens? And the person, Colin Challen, an MP from Huddersfield, I think, said, well, now and again in Parliament, across the spectrum, MPs decide something has not gone right. Let's not talk about the current situation with the Prime Minister, but we're thinking about climate change. So they knew that the Blair government was kind of dragging its feet, and yet the scientific evidence was building up. So they sort of suddenly come to a realization, we've got to try and push this through. So it's a very unusual in British politics that kind of the backbench MPs suddenly start to drive stuff through. So that was there. Political competition, you might not remember it, I do. David Cameron just come in and he decided he wanted to be more green than the Blair government. So they were looking for something to hang their hat on, and climate change was a very convenient one. And so they had a vote blue, go green at some point, sort of campaign. Then there was the all-party parliamentary inquiry, which I was involved in, and I'll explain how that arose, which was interesting. Stern Review, and then there were two policy solutions sitting there. One was statutory annual emissions targets, which the Big Ask asked for. Those of you who know Kevin Anderson of the Tyndall Centre, I suspect he was asking for them 15 years earlier. But it was there in the Big Ask. And then institutional innovation. There'd been a paper written by an economist in Oxford in 2003, and the all-party parliamentary report, which I got involved in, also said a similar thing. And there were also policy entrepreneurs operating who were picking all this up and trying to push things forward. So you had Friends of the Earth. David Cameron was doing the challenge to the UK, to the Blair government. Colin Challen was chairing the all-party parliamentary group, which did the report or inquiry, and David Miliband within the Blair government eventually was asked to pick it up and run with it, which he duly did, and we had the Climate Change Act. Now, we'd just done a national survey of people just after the Big Ask had kicked off, and that showed that lots of people agreed the world's climate was changing, and lots felt all possible action should be taken. But they also felt responsibility for action lay with the government and big business. And we launched that report in the January of 2006. So kind of in the middle of this window. It's interesting. We didn't know, I didn't know at the time, we didn't know at the time. And we also launched it in Parliament. And then we got an inquiry back saying, oh, would one of you like to come on the inquiry we're about to launch on scope for political consensus, which I duly did. So the way we interpreted it is the public felt it's the responsibility of government to act, and yet the government are always constrained by the electoral cycle and argue it's the public who've got to get on with it and act. And the result is that nobody acts. So you can think about this, and I wrote afterwards, not at the time, as a governance trap, that governance couldn't move forward because the two groups were kind of looking at each other and nobody would move first. So in the inquiry, which we did for about 3 months, and then we wrote a report and we took evidence and we had evidence sessions in Parliament and got written evidence came in, we made a number of recommendations, but it was this one that got picked up, that the government established an authoritative independent body similar to the Bank of England's MPC, which had just been set up by Brown 5 years earlier, to report on progress towards meeting them. What then happened was it went into the policy process. I didn't hear much afterwards. We launched this report in the July. And then, lo and behold, there was a Climate Change Act about to be launched. And it was only years later, when I went back to it, I really understood the small part our work had actually played in that, because it had actually made the intellectual case for this, in a way, overriding a parliament and using expert advice to actually hold the government of the day to account, because it was long-term decision-making. And we now have the Climate Change Committee, that's the 7th carbon budget, and I'll just show this actually. And so it's their projections over time show how we would meet the climate targets to reach net zero by 2050 or shortly thereafter. And I'll just show that. The first carbon budget, that yellow, most of the effort is coming from decarbonisation of the electricity system. So moving away from coal and gas to solar and wind. And later on, there's no more scope. We will have produced our electricity entirely by renewables by about 2020, 2043. The little elephant in the room, which if I've got 5 minutes, I will mention, is this. The green is agriculture. Agriculture is highly polluting in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, I hate to say, but it is, and it's seen as very hard to change for various reasons. The fertilizer that's being made artificially requires a lot of carbon to make it. So agri has got a big role to play further down the line, and lots of people, some in environmental science here as well, are working on this problem. It's not a problem that's unknown. So I'll come on to agriculture in a minute, because we've done quite a bit of work on that. The UK CCC does two things. It tries to chart a path for the country to meet the statutory targets, but it also is in charge of the independent assessment of climate risk, which is on the adaptation side. As I showed with Fairborn, the village, which is at risk, and they have big reports on the various risks that are arising as a result of climate change. So I'll briefly say this. For the last 10 years, we've been working on that problem of how do we decarbonise agriculture. And in the 7th carbon budget, you'll find something interesting that on the left-hand side, by 2050, the assumption is almost everything we do can be decarbonised at reasonable cost. I'm not sure whether that's entirely true. But two things. One is transport, which is aviation, and the other, the green line, is agriculture, cannot. And so in order to balance that, you have to remove some carbon from the air. So the proposal has been to have a number of carbon removal technologies, which at the time when I first started working on this looked very much like science fiction, a bit like the nanotechnology I talked about earlier. So I've been working with a big consortium in Sheffield, looking at something called enhanced weathering, and I'll just show you what that means. CO2 in the atmosphere gets dissolved into the rainwater. It normally would just drop on crops, and then there is an interaction with the soil, which, if you add extra particular silicate rocks to the soil, it will, there's very complex chemistry involved in this, which I don't fully understand. It sequesters some carbon, which ends up in the oceans, and then it ends up sequestered as bicarbonate storage. Very long-term sequestration as well. So actually very interesting if it can be shown to be done. And so the idea is you're adding extra silicate to agricultural land. You're not competing for food use, as some other carbon removal technologies do. And our job was to do some public engagement to try and understand how people thought about this technology. Okay. We've got 3 large field trial sites there in the blue dots, and we picked, as some of you in the audience will know, we're quite good at doing one-day workshops on a technology to take people through and help them to understand the technology. We picked 5 locations where we had, in a total, 48 people to discuss for a day this technology of enhanced weathering in the UK. I won't explain exactly why. They've got different characteristics, the different locations. Now, this you might find interesting because it's a lively method. You might note. So at great expense, because we were going to different places, Mid Wales, Hertfordshire, the Yorkshire grain belt, etc. They were all different places, so we wanted our participants to engage with the place they were in and then think about how the technology would affect what was going on there if our agriculture changed. So we had a blank model board made, and the 10 people would sit around this for the whole day, and it would start blank, and then we'd start saying, well, what's important about this place? Can you take one of these model pieces and put it on the model to represent Bilth Wells or wherever we were at the time? And I was quite surprised. So somebody, for example, in the first Welsh one, picked up, we've got 3, you can't see them, there are 3 cats having a kind of friendly fight with each other. And she picked it up and she plunked it on the model and she said, oh, I love living here in Mid Wales. It's so safe. My cats love it here. And so immediately you could see why she valued the local place. And of course, then there was a conversation about extra lorries and stuff like that and how it wouldn't be safe with the new technology. Okay, so we did this, and over the course of a day, you would build up a representation of the place, and people would talk about how the technology affected them. I'm not going to talk in detail about that. All I will say is, I've got 2 more slides, so I can finish. It was interesting. Not a no, but there were some potential no's. So people wanted the technology, if you were going to bring it there, and remember, this would have to happen at huge scale. So you're spreading across all the agricultural land locally on a regular basis, a new material. There's some arguments that it might actually reduce fertilizer use and might help with the soil health. So it's not just a climate intervention. But there were a number of opportunities that people wanted to be focused on, and then a number of issues which would make it unacceptable to local communities. And that's what we're saying, both to the policymakers and to our natural science colleagues on the consortium. You've got to deal with some of these issues. So can you prove it's actually sequestering carbon in the way that the theory says? So local community members said, there's no way we're going to have this here if you can't prove to us it works, which sounds like a simple thing, but it's not. Any environmental contamination, people don't want that. That's not surprising. The psychology of the environment would tell you straight away that people don't like contamination and don't like new things coming into their environment. Remediation plans for quarries, I hadn't thought about that, but that came up quite a lot, that you've got to put that in place because you're quarrying the basalt or whatever material it is out, then crushing it and then sticking it on agri land. And then something that we call mitigation deterrence, which is, let me put it this way. British Airways runs its carbon-intensive aircraft, which some of us, not actually lots of other people, I know, lots of people still use. So they will then pay the farmers to spread basalt on their land. And then British Airways quite happily say their operations are carbon neutral because they paid somebody to draw some down, even though they're polluting at the other end. And it was interesting. So we gave that dilemma towards the end of the workshops. And some people said, no, that actually is a good thing, that they should be paying for it because you should make the polluter pay. But a number of other people said we'd be absolutely outraged if British Airways were just using this in order to continue business as usual. So there's an outrage, what we would call an outrage potential from a psychological perspective attached to were it to be deployed, paid for, governed in the wrong way. I think that would be the way to put it. Okay, I think I'm done. Oh yeah, and the the result of the whole programme of work on enhanced weathering is actually in the 7th Carbon Budget, the Climate Change Committee has decided potentially weathering and another new technology called biochar could be part of a net zero future. And I stress could. That doesn't mean it will happen. There are lots of caveats attached to that. But it's interesting how a major piece of research funded primarily by the Leverhulme Trust as a blue sky science project has led to a change in policy because the evidence is built up over time. And as social scientists, we were saying it's definitely not a no, it's a kind of a cautious yes that people are telling us about this technology, but be very careful about it. So that's my final slide. I'm going to stop, and I'm not going to say very much, actually, in conclusion, because I've gone through quite a lot of things to talk about. But I think I'll just reiterate again, it's very appropriate to be here at UEA, so thank you for the invitation, both from the University and the British Academy, where really the sorts of integrated natural social science consideration have a very long history, and I think you should cherish that. I know Tim O'Riordan, were he here, would definitely say that as well. I think bringing research into policy, in my experience, is not easy. So it requires quite a sustained engagement. So you've got, most academics maybe aren't going to do this successfully, so you've got to be train yourself to have the right temperament. You've got to have a bit of a thick skin to be able to bring science into policy. You've got to look carefully at the problems you're working on and very carefully at your methods, because you'll be challenged if your methods show any weakness or are not as good as they could be. But I think I'll leave you with the thought we shouldn't overlook. Often, again, the environmental problem is seen as a natural science, a bioscience, or a technical engineering issue. And if I leave you with one thing, go back to that Lowry picture that I produced completely by mistake, that it involves people, it involves communities, it can be studied, and they are part of the solution. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Nick.
Yeah.
We've got about, yes, what do you think of this lecture? So, well,
Okay.
please, there's a QR code there. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, if anybody would like to start off. Chap at the front.
Just a lively debate. I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how, I've given a lot of thought and organised a lot of, is it on?
Yeah.
It is on, right.
Yeah.
I'm not talking loud enough, yeah. And I give a lot of time, a lot of thoughts, organise lots of events about how to influence people about issues about climate and the environment. And I've come to the conclusion what we have to focus on are stories.
Yeah.
Human beings live by stories. And if you think about stories in the past, how fast things can change once people accept a new story, like the collapse of the Berlin Wall and collapse of communism, you know, and even the current politics, how a new story sweeps across the country, and we get, So my focus nowadays is to encourage people with a new story where our life we would have to consume a lot less, but we could have a better life because perhaps have less mental health issues and that by having stronger communities.
Yeah. No, I should say actually there are people online, so it's good that you use the microphone for the question. I absolutely agree with you, and again, that's the role very much of, even out of my domain, the social science, it's more into the arts side, which is why I said linguistics around the pylons question. Getting the right stories is critical. I'll put one caveat on that there's a big debate, and some of it's about localizing as well, and making it locally relevant. The one thing we do know from a psychological perspective, though, is if you, and actually work that was done here as well, if you scare people too much in the story, there is a danger they'll back off. And you can think of lots of, lots of campaigns that have, with very good causes like animal rights, which have not gone down well because the images or the tales they're telling are too much for people. So That is the challenge, and it's not an easy one. As a social scientist, I would say, well, you've got to try the stories out, okay? So you work with your climate science colleagues to work out what the right stories might be. Then you basically do testing. And you can learn a lot from very, very short and very easy tests to do. But yes, absolutely, stories.
Okay, thank you. Another one. Yes, in the middle there, and then maybe in the...
Thanks for the talk. Do you think that our ability to deal with big problems like climate change is getting better or worse over your career?
I think that's difficult. I'd be an optimist. I've done a lot of work with engineers. Some of my best friends are engineers, as you might say, and they always surprise. I worked with engineers when doing work on major failures, because obviously that's something they have an interest in. But they couldn't understand why the people were getting stuff wrong, which is why they wanted psychologists involved. So the optimism is there are a lot of really bright, hard-working people working on some of the technical solutions. If you believe it's purely can really just be dealt with as a technical issue. And I don't think it necessarily can. I mean, you'll only get so far, or it might not happen fast enough. So let them do their stuff, and I think that's all really positive stuff. The elephant in the room is the breakdown in the political consensus. And that's added a layer of complexity which we didn't have 5 or 6 years ago. We used to do that early work I mentioned, which was kind of 20, 25 years ago. And then I spent a lot of time after I'd left UEA tracking public attitudes to climate change. And basically they didn't change. And they were same in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, often England. Not much difference. People were seeing climate change getting closer, so we were measuring something called psychological distance. So when we asked a question, is it going to happen in 10 years, 100 years, or now, that more people were saying it's happening now. So it was getting closer, and concern was the same. That is no longer the case, and that's really worrying, and it's happened. Now, is it cause or is it effect? I don't know which is what's driving what. We have certain political parties which have now decided to have a go both at the solutions to climate change, but also the fundamental message as well. This happened in, I'm trying to think when, late 80s? When was the end of the Clinton administration? Can you tell me? Can you remember? You're a political scientist. 1998, 99 it must have been, yeah. So Al Gore was going for election, and he was an environmentalist, as everybody knew. So the Republican Party and the fossil fuel lobby, it's been well documented, decided to have a go at his environmental credentials, which they successfully did. So they started to, what's called, throw uncertainty into the linguistic debate about climate change in the US. Whether that affected the election or not, nobody knows, but it set off a set of political discourses, which it became a wedge issue in a way it hadn't been before in the US. And the evidence is clear as day. Following that point, they'd been tracking people's views on climate change. Republicans, Democrats, they were both the same. And from that point onwards, they diverged, and they've stayed diverged. And then, of course, now it's a wedge issue, and everybody uses it because they're saying, well, my voters think this, and my voters think that. Therefore, I must continue this war. So you can see how it's not a straight, one kind of feeds the other once it's started, and unfortunately it has started in this country. YouGov, I didn't bring it with me, I was going to put it up, has a scary little tracker which it's been doing. I can't remember the exact question. It's something like climate change is primarily man-made, or person-made, or is caused by us. And for many, many, many years, most people will say yes to that. And if you look at it in the last 6 months, it's just started to dip down. Now, what's really interesting is you can filter and this is a UK 1,000 sample, every 3 months they do it. You can filter it by political position. But it's even worse than that. You can filter it. The real question that divides people now is if you voted Leave or Remain in the Brexit vote. And if you filter it by Leave, you suddenly see people's views on climate change have become much more negative. So Leave voters have decided there's a conspiracy around climate change, or whatever. Very complicated, very interesting, and it partly explains some of the positions that are now being taken up by some of the political parties because they think it's popular amongst their voters. So that has completely made the whole question of climate action, intervention, discourse, discussion much more complicated than it was 20 years ago when we did that consensus report, because there was a consensus. Most people believed the scientists. Most people agreed it was a serious problem. Most people agreed something needed to be done about it. That is no longer the case. And so that is my, I didn't want to be pessimistic, but if you ask me, that is the big elephant that we're now dealing with, and it's not a straightforward one. I have had a long-term, really great friend who berated me for peddling all this climate rubbish because it didn't fix with what she'd been told in geography 50 years ago. And I'm saying, why are you getting it? Where are you getting it? And of course, it's the internet, social media is doing it. So you've got, I don't study this, but you can see what's happening. You've got this pools of certainty are going on here, that people are getting into circles of reaffirming information, which takes them down rabbit holes, one way or another. And I have no answer to that, sorry. But it needs a lot of social science thinking and arts thinking to try to unravel it. So it was a great question anyway.
Corinne, the final word goes to you.
Oh, that's a big responsibility. Nick, I get it. You can do things ahead of time to involve people and makes reduces your risk of your problems going wrong later. But what happens when things go wrong and then you need to fix them? Yeah. And, I have several examples, but let's just focus on net zero for a little bit. So net zero is a scientific objective. You need it to tackle climate change, and somehow it's been polarized and politicized. And should we just stop talking about net zero and just talk about tackling climate change? Or how do we deal with this sort of big obstacle to tackling climate change, which is completely not aligned with the science?
Yeah.
I mean, net zero is aligned with the science, just the blockages are.
Very quickly. Okay. I think you need to understand how people are interpreting the terms that have become problematic. So you need some social research to do that. And it may well be you have to change your discourse, that some terms have become so, polluted is the wrong word. It's not the right word, but you understand what I'm saying. Too difficult. And people are now putting their own meanings onto them, that you're not going to change that just by banging around about what it really... net zero is actually quite a difficult concept if you really think about it. It is a science concept in its... And then you try to describe, it's about negative emissions, and people think, what on earth are you saying? So I think it was never a very good concept in the first place, if you really want my view, and I think it's been found out. So I know DESNES is trying to edge away from it, and that's not anything I tried to make them do, but I think they've realised, one or two people actually from this department have been advising them on this, that there are some difficult discourses around this that have to be handled very, very carefully. So it's like the other question. No simple answer to that. But do some work, find out how people are misinterpreting you. And if it is a genuine misinterpretation, then you can probably deal with it. If it's a value dispute, you probably can't deal with it in scientific terms. Yeah, okay.
Right, thank you, Nick. Unfortunately, time's against us. We've got some drinks in the foyer outside for you. So please don't dash off. Join us. I'm sure you'd like to talk to Nick and also colleagues as well. Before I finish, I'd like to thank Hannah Tuff and her team from events here at UEA. I'd like to thank ISIS, who's joined us from the British Academy. Thanks also to the British Academy for providing the funding for this and for organising it. But last and certainly not least, I think, yes, thanks to Nick for journeying back to Norwich and telling us about all the things that he really did when he was in Norwich and what he's done since he left Norwich. So, thank you, Nick.